Hey, today I'm talking about 3 adaptations of the Richard Matheson novella, I Am Legend. And the names of those 3 films are The Omega Man, I Am Legend, and The Last Man on Earth. I'm also going to talk about the book because I really love the book. Firstly is I Am Legend. This is a 1954 sci-fi horror film that is amazing. I love this book so much. This is the second time that I've read it. The first time was about a decade ago. And there's just so much I love about it. Before I get into that though, the premise is that this is a post-apocalyptic world and Robert Neville is the last man left alive and he is struggling with the loneliness, the boredom, and also the unending onslaught of the vampires. There are definitely explicitly vampires in this, but this story, as well as the first adaptation, The Last Man on Earth, are definitely the prototypes for the zombie subgenre, and this book is so good. The prose itself is just so beautifully well done. It really captivates me and makes the most mundane fascinating. Like, he spends so long talking about learning how to use a microscope. I'm like, I know nothing about microscopes. I don't care at all about microscopes, but I was fascinated the entire time just because of the way he was describing it. I mean, the whole thing is wonderful, but I crazy love the first 5 chapters because it really just does a great job of setting up the story and also just like building tension. It really naturally drives the story forward. God, I just kept having to stop and be like, wow, that was just so well written. The end is incredible. I won't spoil what happens, but it ties into the title. The title is the whole point. The entire last page, I'm just like, this is just burned into me. I know every word here. It was kind of, in a sense, pointless for me to reread it because I already know it. My favorite part though was a line that really caught me off guard because this book is surprisingly horny, but what it's really talking about in those instances is he misses his wife. He incredibly misses his wife, and so he lusts after some random vampires, but really it's all about his wife. He always is like talking and debating with himself about all sorts of different ideas and whatnot, and it's really interesting. But one of those points, he's wondering about if these dead people had got to experience love in their life, either to give love or receive love, and then he more or less says that to live a life without love would be a life truly worse than what he's experiencing, which is crazy because basically everything up until then is him talking about how much he ridiculously hates everything. Like, this is literal hell on earth. To exist is pain. But to him, what is yet even worse than this hell is to live a life without love. That floored me. That's so beautiful and tells you so much about his character. As much as he's a grumpy man, he's got a heart. He's got a big, beautiful heart. Oh, so great. It's also a quick read, which I'm always a fan of. So if you've never read this book before or seen any of these movies, I would without a doubt recommend this book. It is an incredibly well-crafted book, such an interesting story. It goes to some really neat places and it's just a delight. It's without a doubt one of my all-time favorite books. I'm so happy I own a copy now, and it's definitely, without a doubt, worth a read. Next up is The Omega Man. This is a 1971 film starring Charlton Heston, and I had seen it before, but I only kind of remember bits and pieces of it. So this definitely starts off being an adaptation of the book. Kind of like the first maybe 10-15 minutes are roughly an adaptation. But then from there, as it gets into like the second act, it becomes its own thing, but it still keeps the spirit of the book alive. Like, he gets the revelation of the title pretty early on. It kind of just ignores it. But what it translates really well from the book is Neville constantly is having these philosophical discussions in his head just about like life and existence and what things mean. And they did such a fantastic job of turning that into actual dialogue between characters and having these things be more tangible actual debates rather than just conversations in his head. Because this one in particular really makes the vampires more of a presence. They're not really vampires, they're kind of more mutated people as a cult, and like the cult costumes are definitely ridiculous, and that's the silliest part of this movie for sure, but it does make sense because they're definitively a cult. I do wish they didn't have the sunglasses, but I get why. There's a cool thing with their eyes that I did like. This is definitely more action-y, but I enjoyed that. I think the action worked well. Charlton Heston was a great lead. They did a good job of nailing the loneliness too and his routine. I loved the co-lead of this film. She was fantastic and added a nice foil to him and just nice layers. And also the ending is, well, the same and different. And it kind of brings about a different moral debate that was so fascinating. And so even if you've seen other ones, I think this one is definitely worth a watch. I mean, on its own, but also if you have seen other ones, because it is its own thing and kind of brings up other questions that are still definitely in line with what the book and other stories are trying to convey. So yes, I crazy love this movie and would totally recommend it. There are some silly moments. It's definitely a 70s movie. It definitely has its dated edges for sure. But as long as you can accept that, it's a fantastic movie that's well worth a watch. Next up is I Am Legend. This is a 2007 film starring Will Smith, and I really enjoyed it. It was a good watch. They do kind of adapt the story, but definitely take it in their own way. What they nailed with this one in particular is the silence. Like, this movie is so quiet. It doesn't feel like a slow, quiet French film, but they definitely nailed he is alone in this world, and just the lack of sound from around him and how that weighs on a person. That was so beautifully done. They nailed his routine as well. It looks really good. There's definitely an action in this, but it's not overwhelming. Every time it happens, it makes sense that it's happening. I also really love the moments where you see him cracking. There's a scene early on in the video store that's really good. And also another one where he sees something in the street and just starts yelling. That's really good. A little thing that I didn't like is that he kind of had a companion with him for the entire movie, which I feel like undercuts it a little bit because so much of the story is just about the loneliness of just like the desperation of wanting just anything else to speak to. I know why they did it, I understand why they did it, and definitely there's emotional moments that really work because they did it, but I feel like they could have just done it a little bit differently just to get him even more alone, to get him more desperate, and that could have added a lot more layers to this. I will say I am definitively talking about the alternative cut of the film, because the theatrical version just ruins the ending. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, the title of the movie just is nonsensical. It's easy to watch the alternative one. It's on the Blu-ray. And honestly, if you're gonna watch just one of these, this is probably the one to watch because it is the most modern. It does look really good. It's probably the easiest for most people to get into. And it is definitely really good. So it is totally worth a watch. I still definitely recommend Omega Man, but like, this one is great. But again, just make sure you're watching the alternative ending, which was the original ending, which is the only ending that makes any sense. So yeah. And lastly is The Last Man on Earth. This is a 1964 film starring Vincent Price, and this is the most straight adaptation of this story for sure. They kind of took like just a couple key elements from the story. Like, the first act is the first 5 pages, which I think that's good, but they kind of messed stuff up. Like, part of his motivation for going over the edge, they didn't really cover, because it's like in the book, in the second day we see him, he has to kill a bunch of children, and that leads to him over drinking at night, which leads to him having a very terrible third day, which leads to even more bad stuff happening. So in the book, it really perfectly builds, but in this, stuff is kind of unmotivated and it doesn't quite work. And you know, like, the house itself, this takes place 3 years into it, but for being 3 years into it, his house is barely put together. Like, there's so many holes you could easily reach your arm through, and you can just so plainly hear everything outside. Like, you're just hurting yourself. What are you doing? I did like they showed the pit where he burns a bunch of the bodies. I think that was really cool, and some good flame effects there. I like the aesthetic of the film for sure. I am a sucker for black and white. Though my biggest issue with the film is without a doubt Vincent Price. He does a narration that's really good. I think that really captures that element from the book really well. So like, he definitely feels alone, and we still get his internal thoughts, and I think that translated very well, and he has a great voice for it. But the physicality of him, he is just this old man who's always hunched over just doing stuff. That's not Robert Neville. Robert Neville is in his 30s. I think he's 36 at the start of it. I think he's about 40 at the end. And Vincent Price does not look even close to that. And like, that can be fine if you're telling something different. But the issue is there's a couple moments where he needs to be more physical, where he kind of has to fight off some of the vampires. The one part that really got me was when he had to chase down a younger person, a woman in her 20s, and it's like, this old man would never be able to catch this woman. Never. Not even, there's zero chance. What are you doing? This is so ridiculous and silly. So yeah, it's definitely incredibly miscast. I did like, though, that there's a speech near the end that they take pretty much verbatim from the book, and I think in and of itself, it works really well. I don't think they really built to it properly, which was kind of weird because that whole section of the book takes place over the course of one night, and that's what they do in the movie, but like it doesn't quite work in the movie. The end is really strange. They definitely did not go with what the book is. I would say they almost went with like the antithesis of the book, which was weird. I don't know what was up with that. I did end up putting this in the liked category because there is a good amount of things that I enjoyed, even though they did mess up a lot of stuff. Would I recommend this one? No. It's an interesting film. Oh, it's soundtrack. The soundtrack is really, really good. And there is a remastered version of it on vinyl that I'm kind of interested in getting because the music just slaps. But yeah, no, anyway. Would I recommend it? No. It's interesting. I mean, maybe if like you are a big fan of the book and you watch the other adaptations and you're like, all right, let's see what the first one's like, then yeah, sure, go for it. But otherwise, like, nah, it doesn't quite work. It is interesting and fascinating, but it's an easy one to skip. Alrighty, now for today's rankings. First up, we got The Omega Man, scenario number 2 in the really like section. And then after that is I Am Legend, scenario number 4, again in the really like section. And then bringing up the rear is The Last Man on Earth, scenario number 8 in the liked section. And this is out of a total of 12 old movies so far this year.